Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be in Lausanne. Apologies if my talk's going to be in English. I don't feel comfortable enough yet to speak in French. So today I'm going to talk about how scientist climate advocacy affects public trust in scientists. And I'm going to especially focus on a study that colleagues and I conducted in Switzerland last year. So we've seen more and more pictures like these in the media, right, over the last years. We've seen more and more scientists taking to the streets, joining protests, legal protests, civil disobedience. We've seen scientists stepping out of ivory towers and advocating. We've seen this all over the world, right? We've seen this also here in Switzerland. And when I see pictures like this, I wonder, well, hi, Julia. I wonder, well, what happens? Right, when scientists do decide to step outside of ivory towers and to engage like this. Scientists haven't just been engaging, they've been publishing opinion pieces also in peer-reviewed journals. So you can see scientists said that, scientists must act on their own warnings to humanity. They've also argued that civil disobedience by scientists can help to press for urgent climate action. And that more generally, the biospheric emergency calls for scientists to change tactics, right? And that more generally, maybe we should be rethinking academia in a time of climate crisis. Now, we've heard of several definitions of scientist engagement today, and I'm going to present you maybe with another one. But I think that when we think about scientists' role in society and policy making, we can think about this as a continuum. So on the one hand, we have sort of the pure scientists, right? These are those that, are in the ivory towers, publish their research, present at a conference, maybe once or twice engage with the media. And then as we move upstream, we have issue advocates, right? So scientists who actively advocate for policies, who engage with policymakers. And then on the very end, we have sort of scientists who engage as activists. So we can think about this continuum as sort of ranging from public engagement to political engagement. But of course, right, it's sort of a blurry line. It's not very easy to distinguish when is someone an issue advocate, when is someone an activist, when does public engagement sort of move into political engagement. But I think that it's very important to study scientists' behavior on this continuum. And why do I think so? I think it is important because scientists' behavior might affect public trust in scientists. And as we've heard in the previous presentation, and I totally agree, we're not seeing a widespread sort of crisis of trust in scientists, right? But if we want to maintain and potentially further increase trust in scientists, I think that is important to understand what happens when scientists engage with the public and policymakers along this continuum. And so during my PhD, I started wondering, well, if we want to maintain public trust, then let's understand what the public thinks that scientists should and shouldn't be doing. So I asked myself, well, what are the normative perceptions of the role of scientists in society and policymaking? So what do both scientists think that they should be doing, and what does the public think that scientists should be doing? So in this study here, we compared the opinions of both scientists and the public in Germany and the US. And this is sort of one of the findings here. So we asked both scientists and the public in Germany, so this data is here in blue, and the US in red. Do you agree that scientists researching climate change should actively advocate for specific climate-related policies? And here you see that 73% of scientists in Germany agreed, and 70% of the public in Germany agreed. And you see sort of similar numbers in the US, where 59% of scientists and 74% of the public agreed. So we see that there is, right, as we've heard also before, sort of a majority agreement among both scientists and the public that scientists should advocate for policies. And more surveys have been published on this topic. For example, Nature did a survey of 92 IPCC scientists, and they found that 81% of scientists agreed that climate scientists should engage in advocacy. Interestingly, when they asked, do you engage in advocacy, 66% said yes. right? So we see there is a discrepancy between 81% thinking that climate scientists should engage and 66% engaging. So this is what colleagues and I have sort of called a perception engagement gap. So scientists perceive that they should be engaging, but they don't engage to the extent that they perceive that they should be engaging. So we have a gap here. And what do scientists that engage in advocacy actually do? So 98% sort of promote science through speeches and publications. Now one could argue whether that's really advocacy or not. But 40% of the 66% have contacted lawmakers or government officials, 43% have signed letters or petitions, and 25% have participated in demonstration, which I think is quite significant. But now keep in mind that these scientists, these are IPCC scientists, right? These are people who work on climate change. So what about scientists more generally? So to find that out, colleagues and I surveyed over 9,000 scientists across 150 countries, all fields and career stages, to get sort of a sense of scientists' perceptions of their role in society and policy making. And we find that now 51% strongly agree that scientists and academics should engage more in advocacy. And remember, this is across all fields, pretty much. And 36% agreed or strongly agreed even that scientists and academics should engage more in legal protests. So that's quite considerable. The paper was just accepted, but we also have a preprint up where you can find more statistics like these. So these are sort of scientist perceptions. But what about public perceptions? So in February 2023, we collected data as part of our global study on trust in science. And again, we asked the public whether they think that, for example, scientists should work with politicians to integrate scientific results into policy making. And you can see that a small majority agrees, and only a minority here, 17%, disagree that scientists should work closer with politicians. When it comes to advocacy, agreement is slightly lower. We find that 42% agree that scientists should advocate, and again, only a minority perceives they shouldn't. And I think interestingly, we find 55% of the public in Switzerland that think that scientists should be more involved in the policymaking process, and again, only a minority thinks they shouldn't be more involved. But I also want to draw your attention here to sort of the gray bars, or the gray parts of the bars, right? So there is still a considerable share of the population that doesn't seem to have a very strong opinion either way. So now we've seen what scientists perceive they should be doing, what the public thinks scientists should be doing. But I think an important question that we've also briefly talked about before was, well, does advocacy affect public trust in science? What does the literature tell us? So overall, in general, scientists are not perceived as less trustworthy when they advocate for climate policies. Within general, I mean, this is when scientists, for example, go on this protest and say, yes, we need more climate action, we need more climate policies, but they don't actually advocate for a specific policy. But we also know that the effect of advocacy on trust depends on several factors. It depends on a specific policy in question. So studies in the US have shown that when scientists advocate for example, subsidies for renewable energy, they're perceived as more trustworthy. But when they advocate for more nuclear power plants to mitigate climate change, they're perceived as less trustworthy. And we've also found in previous studies that public support for the advocated policy really matters, right? So if a scientist advocates for a policy that the public supports, then the scientist is perceived as trustworthy. But if a scientist advocates for a policy with lower public support, they're perceived as less trustworthy. So maybe it isn't really about whether the public thinks that advocating scientists are trustworthy or not in general. It's really more about whether a scientist advocates for a policy with high or low public support. And lastly, the effect of advocacy and trust really also depends on individuals' political orientation. So right-leaning individuals generally perceive advocating scientists as less trustworthy than left-leaning participants. And we recently published this review article on the state of trust in climate science and climate scientists. And we have one whole section on how political engagement affects trust. It's not a very long section because there isn't like that much literature on the topic yet, but we've tried our best to sort of summarize the current state of this literature here. So these previous studies have several limitations, right? So I think one important one is that they rely on advocacy messages by fictional scientists. So this is an excerpt from one of the studies that colleagues and I conducted. That is sort of a stimulus that colleagues in the US conducted. So usually what these surveys do, and what I've done in previous studies, is you present the public with sort of, fake tweets or fake, are they still called tweets? I think so. Or like X posts where, a scientist advocates for a policy. And then you ask them, well, do you trust this scientist? Do you perceive them to be credible? But of course, these stimuli sort of lack both external and internal validity. They lack external validity because we don't know whether the public would react similarly if, they were at home scrolling through X and seeing such a post. Would they react the same way? We don't really know. They might also lack internal validity because we don't really know if the public actually, trusted us that these tweets were real. Another limitation is that previous studies have mostly analyzed the effects of advocacy by individual or single scientists, right? So it's one scientist posting something, commenting somewhere, advocating for a policy. But now what happens when scientists get together in larger groups, in collectives, and start advocating? Well, we don't really know what happens then. We also don't really know much about the long-term effects. So what if, advocating increases trust? Does it last over time? Does it decline? And lastly, previous studies don't consider real behavioral impacts, right? So what happens if advocacy increases trust? Does this change how people vote, for example? Are they more likely to support climate policy? Are they more likely to join protests themselves? Well, we don't know. You see, there's a lot that we don't know yet, right? So we're only getting started doing this kind of work in the social sciences. But the study that I want to present here today, hopefully, we'll try to address all of these points here. And we had a great case study, sort of the case study that I've been waiting for to conduct this kind of research. So last June, the Swiss electorate voted on the climate protection law. And as probably many of you know, over 200 scientists in Switzerland across different disciplines advocated in favor of the policy. So they released a statement, saying why they supported the climate protection law, and then they signed the statement, and this was publicly available. So we have a great case study to sort of study also long-term effects and real behavioral implication of scientist advocacy. So the details are not so important, but basically we conducted a pre-post study. So 10 days before the voting, we sampled the Swiss public, and then we sampled them again 3 to 4 weeks after the vote and looked at how sort of advocacy influenced trust in scientists. And this is just a very brief overview. So basically, we randomized our participants into a control and an experimental group and assessed trust in scientists. And post-votes, about 4 weeks later, participants, importantly, were reassigned to the same conditions. And we again measured trust. And this sort of allowed us to see whether we had any long-term effects of advocacy. So this was sort of the structure of our survey. Importantly, we also pre-registered our study. We had a very well-powered sample. You see we had over 1,600 participants. So we assessed sociodemographics, climate change concern, and then importantly, all participants were provided with a description of the climate protection law, just to make sure everyone was on the same page, everyone knew what this was about. And then we randomly assigned people to a control group and an experimental group. And I'm going to tell you in a second what we showed them. And then we assessed trust in scientists, the normative perceptions of the role of scientists in society. And then we asked them, well, if you were to vote today, what would you vote? Yes, no, would you abstain? So the control group read an explanatory text about popular initiatives. So very, general, something like, you need like 100,000 signatures to start an initiative. And then the experimental group saw a text of the same length. And they saw original excerpts from the advocacy statement issued by scientists. So we tell them over 230 scientists in Switzerland have issued this statement, and then we sort of showed them parts of the original excerpt. We also had 2 attention checks just to make sure that we excluded sort of participants that were just, quickly selecting the midpoint of the scale everywhere. Yeah, so what do we find? So I think very interestingly and importantly, we find that participants exposed to the advocacy statement actually trusted scientists more than those in the control group. And you can see here the variables in bold are the significant variables. So basically, being exposed to the advocacy statement actually increased trust in scientists among the control group. We also find that left-leaning participants trusted scientists more than right-leaning participants, which is in line with sort of previous studies. We also find, in line with what we've just heard before, also that participants in urban areas were more likely to trust scientists than participants in rural areas. But very importantly, we find this, down here, we find this interaction effect between being an experimental group and right-leaning political orientation. And let me visualize this for you. So what this means is we see that on the left-hand side, not sure if you can see the pointer, but on the left-hand side here, these are people with politically left-leaning orientation, and here you have people with politically right-leaning orientations. And you can see that people in the treatment group, so left-leaning individuals in the treatment group had considerably higher trust than left-leaning individuals in the control group. But what is very important that among right-leaning participants, there is no statistically significant difference between people in the control group and the treatment group. So basically, in other words, it means that there is no evidence that being exposed to the advocacy statement backfired on right-leaning participants' trust. So if you're a right-leaning individual filling out the survey, it didn't matter if you were exposed to the advocacy statement or not, your levels of trust in scientists were pretty much the same. They were not statistically different. So there was no effect sort of for right-leaning participants. And I think this is important, right? Because we often hear scientists being reluctant to advocate because they're afraid they're going to lose trustworthiness or credibility, especially with certain audiences, right? Mostly right-leaning audiences, but we don't really find that here. Also, interestingly, we find no effect of the advocacy statement on voting intentions. So just people that saw the advocacy statement were no more likely to say that they would vote in favor of the law. We've talked about objectivity before too, right? Often the argument is made that, maybe as a scientist I shouldn't be advocating because I'm going to be perceived as less objective. So we wanted to test that, and we did. And you can see we asked this question, to what extent do you believe that these over 230 scientists are objective in their assessment of the law? And you can see that a large majority, 55%, I have to do my math today here, 55% actually agreed that scientists are objective when they assess the law, and only 14% believed that they were not objective. But again, right, we see 30% there do not seem to have a very strong opinion either way. So then 3 weeks after the vote, approximately 4 weeks after they had first been surveyed, we resampled the same participants. So we were able to resample about 60% of the original sample. And importantly, the two samples did not differ significantly on like age, gender, or any other demographics. We again split them or assigned them to the same groups and assessed trust in scientists, normative perceptions. And this time we asked them, if you voted, what did you vote for? Did you vote for yes, no, or do you prefer not to say? And again, we find that participants exposed to the advocacy statement actually trusted scientists more. So exposure to the advocacy statement increased trust in scientists. And again, we find that left-leaning participants trusted scientists more than right-leaning participants. But this time, down here, you can see we find no significant interaction effect for the two variables, which means that people exposed to the advocacy statement trusted scientists more, irrespective of their political orientation. But again, here we find that the effects of advocacy, we find that the effects of advocacy, of the advocacy statement on trust were robust across time, so we controlled for that. And so basically levels of trust in scientists increased and remained them on the same higher level across this 1 month period. It's just a month, it's not a very long period, but at least we do see that these effects are somewhat robust over time. And lastly is what I wanted to say before. Again, we find no effect of the advocacy statement even on self-reported voting behavior. So let me summarize these findings, because I know I've just been presenting you with a lot of findings. But basically, both pre and post voting, exposure to the advocacy statement actually increased trust in scientists, and its robust was effect over time, at least over a period of like 4 or 5 weeks. We find that pre-vote advocacy increased trust in scientists, especially among left-leaning participants, and there was no effect among right-leaning participants, but we did not find this effect in the post-vote survey. We also find that only a small minority, right, 14–15%, perceived the advocating scientists not to be objective. But we also found, against our hypothesis, that voting intentions and sort of actual or self-reported voting behavior were unaffected by advocacy. However, we did find that trust in scientists was actually a very strong predictor of voting intentions and voting behavior. So we could imagine that over time, advocacy increases trust in scientists, and then trust in scientists sort of, actually affects people's voting behavior. So there might be sort of a more indirect effect long term. But of course, it should be noted that the climate protection law, while it was, a great case study to look at sort of collective advocacy, this law was supported by a majority of the public, right? And as we've heard before, previous studies have also shown that when a policy is supported by a majority, this tends to have positive effects on scientists' trustworthiness. So the question is also, what would the effects of advocacy on trust in scientists then be if, what if the law had been rejected? That could have potentially affected the results of our study. We also find that scientists' hesitance to engage in advocacy for fear that it might compromise their objectivity and undermine public trust is really not supported by our data. And I think perhaps the fact that, perceived objectivity was not compromised at all could also be because a large group of scientists from different disciplines were advocating from the policy, right? So perhaps if it's only one scientist that advocates for a policy, that person could be perceived as not so objective. But when it's 200 scientists, right, from all different disciplines advocating for one policy, this could really be what, could help scientists also to maintain sort of their perceived objectivity when they advocate. And lastly, we find no effect of advocacy on voting behavior. So according to our study, at least, maybe the current types of advocacy are not really helping to actually change people's real life behaviors. But there might also be some methodological reasons as to why we didn't find the effect. So first of all, maybe just presenting people a statement was just not enough to change people's opinions, right? People have pretty strong political opinions usually, and just reading a text, even if it's a real world text, maybe it's just not enough to change people's actual behavior. Maybe it would have been different, right, if you'd shown them, a video by a scientist, for example, advocating. And honestly, we might have been too late conducting our survey because in Switzerland, a lot of people vote via mail, right? And we assess people 10 days up to 1 week sort of before the voting. So maybe people had already voted, right? They might have already cast their vote. And, then our intervention obviously wouldn't have had an effect. And unfortunately, we didn't ask them if they had already cast their vote via mail, which is, I think, a big limitation of our study. But, it could definitely be that there are sort of long-term indirect effects where advocacy over time, increases trust in scientists, and then trust in scientists sort of affects real-world behavior. And we've seen that in other studies, that especially when people are faced with sort of uncertain and complex situations, such as climate change or the pandemic, individuals really follow the advice by scientists. So it's really important that we see that advocacy can actually help to increase trust in scientists. And to come back to sort of the continuum that I presented before, this study really looks at, sort of the issue advocate area of the continuum, right? But there are still very, very few studies that look at what happens when scientists engage in activism, when they're on the very, very end of the spectrum. And we've seen some first empirical studies published on this topic, but we still know very little about this. So I hope that more research will be conducted that helps us to sort of determine how scientists' behavior along the whole continuum affects trust in scientists. And before I conclude, I just wanted to take a minute to thank all of my amazing co-authors on this paper. It was really a collective of scientists across Switzerland and the US who worked on this paper together. It's currently in review and hopefully will be published by the end of the summer. Let me know if you would like to see a draft of the paper. I'm happy to share that with all of you. And please let me know if you've got any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for this really super interesting talk. Do we have questions in the room, or should I? Okay, yeah, so please.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I also happen to work with Reto Knuti at ETH, so thank you for this paper. I have a major question for all the survey that you've been conducted and the study in general, and that would also work for Fabienne, I think. My question is, all the people that answer the question, they answer a scientific study, right? Therefore, how much likely is it that they will be in favor of science, they will trust the science in which they participate? Do you have that kind of bias taken into account into your study? Yeah, that's a great question. I get it almost like 80% of the time, or 80% of it every time I give a talk. So I think I now sort of know how to answer. So, I mean, you know, of course, one can argue that people who participate in scientific surveys in general maybe have slightly higher trust in scientists than the average person on the street, right? That said, you know, we have a representative sample in terms of like age, gender, education, income. So it is very representative in a lot of ways, and I think it would be hard to imagine that, you know, it's representative for so many variables, but it isn't representative for trust in scientists. So I think having representative samples overall, I think, is just one way to address that. Another, I think, important comment is that, as we've seen also in the previous talk, there are so many different surveys, and a lot of them use very different methods to recruit people. Some did with telephone interviews. We had a global study where we also had people going into the field, like really asking random people on the street, and the message does seem to be the same across all of these different studies, right, which gives them some validity. So I think, yes, in general, it is a problem, but, you know, if people have a better way for us to do it, then we would be, you know, we would be happy to know that. But I think just, yeah, making sure that the samples are representative on so many other variables probably goes a long way to addressing that.
Thank you very much for your presentation, very interesting, and also your work that I have the honor to read before this meeting. I have a question about the right-wing, left-wing impact. So I know a bit what in US they worked on conservatives, have been done in relation with scientific trust, but what about Switzerland, in specific in this case? Because, of course, climate the law on climate change was proposed against the proposal by the Swiss People Party, the right-wing People's Party. And my question is about the specific effect of the right-wing supporters, and in general, in connection with this idea of why right-wing citizens are less supportive for advocacy by scientists. Do you have a hypothesis to interpret this kind of result? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much to say about this. I think I will start by saying that we just conducted a study on trust in scientists in 68 countries. And we see that only in very few countries we actually see an effect of political orientation and trust. And that's because I think, you know, so many studies were based on the US on this topic, right? And there we see very strong effects, also in our study. But if you look in a global context, there is only, I think, 20 out of 70 countries where we actually see an effect of political orientation and trust. So overall, this is a very Western, mostly like North American phenomenon. To your question about why, you know, of course, like, you know, when it comes to climate change, it's a more specific topic, right? It's not about trust in scientists in general. So especially here, as the right-leaning parties were sort of advocating against the policy. I guess it's not surprising, right, that right-leaning, that we see these effects, sort of. I think more broadly, we've also seen in the US that actually in the 70s, conservatives trusted scientists more than liberals, and that this pattern has sort of shifted, where now liberals trust scientists more than conservatives, but this hasn't always been the case. And this led us to conclude that, I'm not sure, I don't think there's historical data for Switzerland, but maybe you know more about that. But in the US, where you really have data going back to the 70s, you see how it just really shifts. And that is mostly because of the way that political parties also talk and approach science, right? If you vote for a party that openly says that, scientists shouldn't be trusted, then of course you're also as an individual less likely to trust scientists. So I think it really depends on the attitude that the political party that you support has towards scientists more than your actual political orientation. Because we see also in some countries, in this other study, we saw that actually left-leaning peoples have lower trust. And when we looked into the specific countries, like what's happening here, there we see political parties on the right spectrum that are actually really pro-science, because they have more technocratic governments, and so they rely more on like science and technology and technical expertise. So it really seems that it depends on how political parties view and approach science and scientists, and that sort of is then reflected in how voters see scientists. But yeah, we could have a very long debate on this, I'm sure.
Thank you. Are there other questions in the room? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. With seeing the results that increased advocacy, increased trust in scientists, I wonder if we can make point for the opposite. Does the lack of advocacy can, in the long term, undermine or weakens public trust in scientists?
So your question is that what happens if scientists didn't engage? Could this have negative effects over time? Yeah, that's a great question, a great way to think about this. So I should say the way that we assess trust in scientists was we asked them we had 12 items about 4 dimensions of trustworthiness: competence, benevolence, integrity, and openness. And benevolence is, for example, really about, do you think that the scientist acts in the public interest? And we mostly see that the positive effect of advocacy and trust in scientists is really because people think that, wow, scientists care, right? They are engaged in society. And we see that the public wishes for them to be more active and in society and policy making. So I think that is a great point, that if the public has those expectations of scientists and scientists don't meet those expectations, mostly because I think a lot of them are not aware of this kind of data, right? And they still have false beliefs about how advocacy would affect their credibility, then I think that this could potentially have long-term negative consequences for trust in scientists if public expectations aren't met by scientists. Yeah, great question.
Thank you. I have a question in between. And then I have a question maybe. Do you think your results are really related to climate, which is a debated subject but not that debated anymore? Are your results kind of generalizable to other topics, or how would you consider the link between the climate or trust in science in general on other topics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would expect a lot of people, not from me, but I think a lot of colleagues are probably working on COVID vaccine advocacy and trust in scientists. I would be surprised if there isn't a whole wave of that, followed by a whole wave of AI and trust in scientists. I think to some extent I could imagine that they're relatable, right? I think that probably also in the COVID pandemic, right, if you supported vaccination, you probably perceive the scientists advocating for vaccination as more trustworthy. So I think that probably still holds true. And I think that maybe more right-leaning individuals who think that science shouldn't dictate what they should or shouldn't do would probably also feel the same about different topics. But on the top of my head, I cannot think of a study that would compare different advocacy for a lot of different topics. Yeah.
Thank you. There was Gabriel. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll keep it short. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on a distinction that I think is extremely important for today's conversation and for this conversation more broadly, that you sort of introduced without really elaborating on it, between trust in science and trust in scientists. I think it makes a huge difference, also related to Augustin's introduction, and if maybe also trust in expertise, if there are three different things. It's, you know, science and technology. So we need to talk more, because I am also at ETH working on those topics after some time at Harvard. So it's a lot, it's a big deal, trust in science. But most of the time we're not speaking of science, we're speaking of something else. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, thank you. Sound exactly like reviewer 2, because that's the question we got about, like, why trust in scientists and not trust in science. Here, but also in our global study, we ask specifically about trust in scientists, because we think that science is too broad, right? Science itself could include scientific institutions, scientific funding, there is scientific methods, right? And previous studies have shown that while these, trust in scientific institutions, trust in scientific methods, trust in scientists, while they are all correlated, maybe like around, 50, 60, like 0.5, 0.6, they're not measuring the exact same thing, right? And so in our study, we provided a definition of scientists, and we specifically measured trust in scientists working in their own country. Because we think that it's easier for the public, or we can probably make sure that people think about something, they all think about the same thing when they think of scientists, but if we leave it open and just say science, there's so many things that people could think of, right? Whether it's methods, scientists, institutions, funding. So we think that science is just too general, and people probably think about very different things, which is why we assessed it with trust in scientists. And that's also what has been done by the Wellcome Global Monitor, previous large-scale survey on the topic. So we specifically assess trust in scientists as sort of the actors who do the science, communicate the science, who engage. In terms of experts, I think that is a difficult one, especially when you want to do research across countries, right? Because sometimes experts can be considered politicians or policymakers, so it's not really clear who experts are and what considers expertise, right? And then of course, it opens a whole nother debate, but I would be very interested talking more about this today or at ETH or somewhere. Yeah, thank you.
Do we maybe have a last question in the room, or and afterwards you can continue the discussion during the break and have some air and some coffee. So, if there are no other questions, thank you very much, Viktoria, for your talk.